immediately claiming central space. This pawn thrust opens diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, setting a dynamic tone, instantly challenging the center's dominion. This Sicilian defense sets up dynamic counterplay and immediate pawn tension, nurturing central influence and preparing for pawn advances. This develops a key piece towards the heart of the board, securing the central pawn and preparing for a solid Sicilian defense, opening lines for a bishop. Opening the center immediately challenges black's pawn structure and creates dynamic possibilities. The pawn capture unlocks the c-file, initiating a dynamic struggle for central influence and piece activity, instantly liberating the queen's diagonal. This central pawn grab seizes more space and activates the knight for immediate skirmishes, challenging white's central pawn and developing a knight to a natural, active square. Solidifying central presence, this knight prepares for rapid development and future pawn advances. Preparing nc7 and perhaps b5, it discourages white's nc3 advance, subtly shaping the queenside. Asserting a firm grip on the center and preparing to support the pawn on e4. This development immediately contests the d5 square and aims to coordinate the kingside forces, hinting at potential queenside expansion later. Challenging the knight's secure square. This sortie aims to disrupt white's smooth development by immediately questioning the bishop's placement and opening up tactical possibilities. It's a bold, if somewhat provocative, statement designed to gain initiative, challenging the knight's seemingly safe outpost. This bishop move immediately creates tactical complications and forces black to address the pin on the f6 knight, potentially disrupting their pawn structure or allowing white to gain material. Challenging the knight's forward position. Black opts for a proactive defense to address the bishop's looming threat. This pawn push aims to disrupt white's active piece placement and potentially open lines for counterplay later. It's a move that immediately demands white's attention, forcing a decision about the knight and setting the stage for a dynamic middle game where piece activity and pawn structure will be paramount, clearing a path for the queen to potentially join the attack. This repositioning of the bishop avoids immediate conflict while maintaining a watchful eye on black's king and the d4 square, subtly restricting pawn advances. The bishop on h4 now feels quite exposed, and advancing the g-pawn further weakens the kingside structure, potentially inviting immediate tactical skirmishes or creating lasting structural deficiencies. Retreating the bishop to g3 re-establishes a defensive posture, allowing white to consider options like recapturing the pawn on d4 if black were to venture a piece there, while also indirectly pressuring the kingside. This subtle repositioning aims to consolidate white's position and prepare for future pawn advances or piece development without immediately confronting black's aggressively advanced g-pawn, creating a delicate balance of threats and counter-threats. Developing the bishop to g7 aims to solidify black's kingside pawn structure, particularly after the aggressive g5 push, and simultaneously prepares to castle, bringing the king to safety and activating the rook for potential central play. This move also creates a robust defensive diagonal for the bishop, which can become a powerful attacking piece in the long run. Shielding the queen behind the pawn on d4. White prepares to launch a kingside assault by castling queenside and opening the h-file, a classic attacking pattern emerging from the Sicilian defense. Asserting control over the central squares with this knight transfer, black aims to free his kingside and potentially challenge white's central pawn structure, while also preparing for further development and a more active piece placement, perhaps eyeing the c2 square or supporting a d5 push down the line. Stepping the knight to b3 cleverly aims to redeploy it to c5. a square that would exert significant pressure on black's queenside and potentially disrupt their pawn structure. This maneuver also clears the d4 square, allowing for future pawn advances or other pieces to occupy that central outpost, adding to white's growing spatial advantage. Black's knight on e5 creates a fascinating dual threat, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure with the potential for a timely nxd4, while simultaneously eyeing the kingside for future tactical opportunities. Fending off the knight's potential invasion and solidifying the kingside is the clear intent, though it does create a slight vacuum on the kingside diagonals and potentially exposes the f-pawn later if black decides to counterattack along the g-file. Expanding on the queenside is a bold gambit, aiming to seize space and potentially disrupt white's queenside structure, though it does leave the b-pawn somewhat exposed and could open lines for white's pieces if not handled carefully. Bolstering the bishop's influence. This maneuver aims to relocate the piece to a more active square, potentially supporting advances on the kingside or reinforcing the central pawn structure against black's queenside expansion, proactively securing a foothold on the b-file. This placement directly contests the open pathway, potentially disrupting white's queenside ambitions and preparing for a future advance that could challenge the c3 knight's influence. A daring positional gamble, aiming to seize control of the central squares and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure, though it leaves the king's defenses somewhat porous. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, black aggressively challenges white's knight and seeks to disrupt the pawn structure, aiming to gain space and initiative by cramping white's pieces and potentially opening lines for future attacks. Shifting the knight to d1, a seemingly passive retreat, aims to redeploy it to a more impactful square, perhaps c3 or even b2, to shore up the queenside or join the attack on the kingside. This maneuver also frees up the e2 square for further pawn advances or piece development, creating a more flexible pawn structure for white. The intention is to build a solid defensive wall while preparing a counterstrike, possibly on the kingside or by creating queenside pressure after consolidating. Breaking open the center with this knight exchange creates a dynamic imbalance, and black must now carefully consider the structural implications for the queenside pawns, as white's pieces are poised to exploit potential weaknesses. The capture on d4 strategically reclaims central presence, reinforcing white's pawn structure and preparing to contest the d-file, while black's knight sacrifice on d4 might have been intended to disrupt white's development and open lines for counterplay. Now white has the opportunity to consolidate and consider pawn breaks like c3 or a4 to gain space. On the queenside, black ignites the center, a bold gambit seeking to shatter white's harmonious development and liberate their own pieces from their passive positions. This thrust immediately challenges the d4 knight and forces white into immediate defensive considerations, potentially creating opportunities for tactical complications or a dynamic pawn structure battle. Unleashing the d-file, white immediately contests central influence, forcing black to make a decision about their knight and potentially opening pathways for white's pieces that were previously blocked. This exchange gambles on black's pawn structure potentially becoming compromised in the ensuing exchange, and it crucially redirects the immediate focus to the center of the board. The queen's journey to the center, while seemingly active, immediately exposes it to white's developing pieces, hinting at a potential tactical skirmish rather than a smooth positional consolidation. Initiating a central pawn thrust now seizes the opportunity to disrupt black's potentially overextended queenside structure before their minor pieces can fully coordinate a defense. aiming to create lasting weaknesses in the pawn chain while also opening lines for white's own pieces. Securing the monarch amidst this tactical jumble becomes paramount as castling finally brings the king to relative safety behind the pawn shield, a crucial step in consolidating the position after the recent pawn exchanges and knight maneuvering. A subtle repositioning, preparing to connect the rooks and potentially eye the kingside if opportunities arise, while also solidifying the pawn structure and indirectly supporting the d4 square from further pressure. A powerful initiative is being seized as black re-engages the center, aiming to liberate the strategically important d-file and challenge white's control of the crucial central squares. This commitment of the rook hints at a desire to disrupt white's harmonious piece development and potentially create imbalances for dynamic play. Shifting the queen to e3 abandons the defense of the d4 knight and opens up lines for attack, hinting at a potential queenside expansion or a repositioning to support a central push, while simultaneously creating a slight vulnerability on the kingside if black can exploit the lack of central piece support. A solidifying maneuver. This bishop repositioning strengthens the queenside pawn structure while simultaneously preparing to challenge the open c-file, aiming to disrupt white's potentially dominant knight placement. Gaining crucial central influence. The knight's repositioning to f2 aims to support the d4 square and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside, while simultaneously reinforcing the defense of the king's sanctuary. Undermining white's pawn chain by capturing on c3 creates an immediate pawn majority for black on the queenside and potentially opens the b-file for future pressure. Reclaiming the bishop clears the path for your pieces to connect and exert pressure along the c-file, which is currently black's most accessible avenue of attack. Observe how the exchange, though seemingly simple, creates a subtle yet significant shift in the board's dynamic, potentially opening up lines for your rooks to enter the game more actively. The black queen ventures out to e6, a provocative positioning that aims to disrupt white's piece coordination and potentially pressure the e3 bishop. This maneuver creates immediate tension, forcing white to carefully consider how to react to this aggressive queen placement. It also opens up possibilities for black's own pieces to become more active on the queenside, as the d5 pawn is no longer directly defended by the queen's presence on d5. Securing the king is paramount, a preemptive step away from immediate threats on the kingside, allowing for future defensive maneuvers like a rook to the g-file. The bishop now aims to reroute, potentially to f5 or e6, to pressure white's central pawns and re-establish some attacking presence. Expanding outward, white aims to break free from black's tight grip on the queenside by advancing the b-pawn, seeking to gain some breathing room and potentially open lines for counterplay. Asserting control over the open c-file is paramount, and this rook maneuver masterfully accomplishes that, simultaneously preparing to pressure white's queenside pawn structure. The rook now actively occupies the crucial open d-file, challenging black's queen and preparing for potential incursions into enemy territory. Sacrificing a rook here, while seemingly bold, abandons the vital c-file and allows white to establish a dominant battery on the d-file. The resulting exchange leaves black's king significantly exposed, with few defenders and open lines for white's queen and rook to exploit. It's a gambit that feels more like a strategic miscalculation than a calculated risk, trading material for a positional disadvantage that will be very difficult to overcome. A crucial repositioning to reclaim lost material. This exchange fundamentally alters the landscape by simplifying the central pawn structure and opening the queen's diagonals, forcing black to reassess their immediate threats and long-term plans as the tempo gained now allows white to consolidate and develop more effectively. Sacrificing the knight here is a desperate attempt to inject some life into the position, hoping to exploit any lingering weaknesses around white's monarch or create counterplay. Black's king is relatively safe for now, but the pawn structure is becoming a bit of a sieve. The immediate tactical outcome will likely hinge on white's ability to consolidate and maintain material advantage, or black's success in disrupting white's coordination. This kind of aggressive, albeit risky, play is often born from a position that feels difficult to defend passively. Reclaiming the initiative. This aggressive queen repositioning aims to sever black's central control and expose their vulnerable king. A startling maneuver. This knight's daring sortie forces a crucial decision, disrupting white's recently established queenside blockade and directly threatening the monarch, potentially unraveling the entire defensive structure. The king cautiously retreats, seeking sanctuary behind the pawns. A stark contrast to the tactical storm brewing on the queenside where the knight's fork threat is now neutralized, shifting the focus to solidifying the center and preventing further queenside incursions. The rook's repositioning to the c-file aims to contest this crucial open file, potentially disrupting white's king's safety and offering a chance for counterplay after a tumultuous middle game. Snatching the pawn on a6. White aims to recover material and simplify, but this gambit leaves the king precariously exposed in the center, potentially inviting a devastating counterattack from black's unleashed pieces. The knight, having accomplished its disruptive mission on e3, now seizes the opportunity to eliminate a powerful attacking piece from the board, sacrificing the queen to eliminate the potent knight and open lines toward black's castled king, while also simplifying into a likely winning endgame given the material advantage. Finally, the material is balanced after a wild exchange, and this bishop recapture prepares to solidify black's queenside pawns. The exchange of minor pieces has fundamentally altered the board's character, presenting white with a straightforward advantage in activity. Developing the bishop to d1 aims to consolidate this initiative by bringing a previously passive piece back into play, a necessary step to counter black's connected passed pawns, which are now a significant threat that demands immediate attention and careful maneuvering to neutralize. Suddenly, the rooks are poised for a duel on the open first rank, aiming to sever white's remaining defenses.